Hello, this is week 10. We're going to talk about business rules. It's for CIT 170. It's a 3-hour course called Database Design Fundamentals. All assignments you should get off of Blackboard, and you should submit all your homework on Blackboard. Okay, so why do we need database rules? Well, building a database is often done by a few, but the resulting system is going to be used by many. And so if you just go off in a room by yourself, you won't have the benefit of all the experience that's in all the users. When business rules allow designers to understand all the requirements that users need for the database to fill, it really is two-way communications. Oftentimes the designer writes down, I understand that you need to do thus and such and so and this, and the users look at it and go, well, but what about? And so it's a way to negotiate and to be sure that everybody understands it, because just like building a house, it's a whole lot easier to move things on paper. If you spent 6 weeks getting all the functionality that you thought they wanted done, you deliver and they say, well, but it doesn't do what we need it to do, you've wasted 6 weeks and a lot of credibility. Upon completion, the database delivers must be measured against the business rules, so that when you think you're done, one of the ways you know that you're done is to go through the business rules and see if you met all the objectives that users set before you started. Examples of projects without business rules. I want a user-friendly way to manage all the information in a retail store. It's too broad, and there's no way to measure success. Whenever you see the word all, or all means you don't know, you're never going to get to all the information. And the other dead giveaway is if somebody says, this software will improve our operation. Well, improve it how? I mean, there's no way to know when you've succeeded. You need a broad way to measure success. Designers may think that they have to measure inventory, location, and cost, and they will have managed all the information. But the user expects them to also get a replacement system that supports multiple vendors for each product. If the designer does what he thinks, the users are going to be very upset and there'll be a lot of money wasted. Project statements that try to define all the rules are cumbersome and make it hard to grasp the high-level objectives of the projects. I've seen people who said, well, I'm just going to write, it turns out to be a novel, about why they thought about doing this and all the things that they've considered and all the things that they want to do. It's very hard to dig it out of text. It's a whole lot better if you can make bullet points. All right, so what are business rules? A business rule is a statement that imposes some form of constraint on the specific aspect of a database, such the elements within a field specification for a particular field or the characteristics of a given relationship. And we're going to talk more about that. You base a business rule on the way the organization perceives and uses its data, which you can determine from the manner in which the organization functions or conducts its business. So if there's no reason to know the average time a product sits on the shelf, there's no reason to try to capture the data for that. And we're going to talk later that it's often you're going to have the capability to do things that nobody ever considered before. And so before you say, well, we've never done that or we don't have any need for that information, you need to think, what is the economic value if you had that information? Business rules define choices. The data that you finally choose to store and how you decide to store it will be determined by how the organization uses its data. A hospital may wish to store times for various elements to the second. A warehouse may require only the date for any given event. It takes more room to store to the second. So if you store the hospital information to the date, they won't be able to get useful information. And if you store the warehouse to the second, Unless you figure out some payback for it, you've wasted a lot of space. Developing business rules means talking to those who will use the data so that you can understand their data needs. And again, it's an iterative process. You go talk to them, you write the business rules that you understood, you go back to them and say, if it did all these things, what are we missing? And you'll be amazed at all the things that you learn the third or the fourth time. But it's better even the sixth time than it is to spend a year writing a system and then find out that you did something like storing hospital information to the day when it doesn't work for what they've got to do. Users typically want to enter less data. It's just, people would like to not have any paperwork or any data entry. The data consumers often want more data entered. The creativity and the things you need to do are, what are new paybacks that the legacy systems do not support? And I can tell you lots of war stories, but it's amazing when you start getting granular data, all the things that you can understand that you never knew before. And it doesn't always require more data entry. Is there a better way to collect data? Does the system already know the information before you have to put it in again? Let's take registering for college. In the old days, you had to write your name and address for every class. Hopefully, any system now has data so that everybody uses the same data. So once you've told the college or the university your name, address, age, and all your personal information, they have access to it and you don't have to keep re-entering the same thing. The rules influence a wide variety of database issues: the data you collect and store, the manner in which you define and establish relationships, the type of information that the database can provide, and the very security and confidentiality of the data itself. A generic set of business rules seldom apply to two or more organizations. In fact, I wrote a system for a tobacco company in Maysville that also owned a tobacco company in North Carolina. And when I went there all sure that I was going to have exactly what they needed, I found out that I didn't. And what I even found out more interesting was that they both had ideas that the other one hadn't thought of, and together we were able to build a better system for both organizations. Even moving between locations of the same company, you often find different needs. In that case, it's important to understand the differences and which ones have no payback and which are truly needed and have economic value. But anytime you have somebody who says, we wrote this code and it will work everywhere, you've met a fool. An example of typical business rule: a ship date cannot be prior to the order date for any given order. Now that seems reasonable, but unless you put it down, you may forget to code it. This particular business rule imposes a constraint on the range of values and the element of the field specifications of the ship date field, but it's based on the order date field. Types of business rules: you have database-oriented business rules. They impose constraints that you can establish within the logical design of the database. An example: we conduct business exclusively with vendors in the Pacific Northwest. That means that you can have a business rule that limits the values that you can enter into the VIN state to Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. You can establish the business rules constraints in a meaningful manner by modifying the range of value elements in the field specifications of the VIN state field. Now, one of the things that you get, some people will say, well, I'm not going to put it in the database. I'm going to put it in program number A because it's easy to code and I won't have to worry with it. Well, over the decades that this system will be used, other programs and applications will go and want to be using the VIN state. And it's a whole lot better if you can put those kind of constraints in your database than it is if you have to stick them in every application program, because if you've got 5 applications that are going back to Venn state, when somebody decides that they're going to start dealing with California, you've got to go find all the programs, and much panic arises when you're in those kinds of situations. Now, for full disclosure, there's some things you can do in an industrial grade database like Informix or MySQL or Microsoft SQL that you can't do in Access. So we're talking concepts here, but it's something that's important to note, that it's better, if possible, to do it with constraints in the database than it is to do it in application code. Application-oriented business rules impose constraints that you cannot establish within the logical design of a database. An example, a customer with a preferred status receives a 15% discount on all purchases. I don't know of a way that you can put that in the database, but you still something that the business has been doing for preferred customers, and the new system or your new database is going to need to support. This business rule determines the amount of discounts applied to customers' purchases and is based on a particular status. You can't establish the constraint meaningfully in the logical design for 2 reasons. There's no field in which to store the discount amount. The amount is a result of a calculation, and calculated fields are not allowed in the table. And you wouldn't want to store a calculated field in a table, because storing it means that it's static and something could change that would affect the calculation, but yet you'd still have the old value stored. Number 2, there's no way to indicate the criterion used the customer status to determine the discount. This is a rule you must establish within the physical design of the database or the database application. And you have the same sort of problems with these that you had when we were talking about hard coding in applications, that you only have certain states that you can have in Venn code. What you're probably going to want to do, if you can't stick it in your database, and I don't think you can this one, is you're going to have routines so that anybody that's trying to calculate discounts is going to call that routine, so that if 20 programs call that routine over 10 years from now, and you have to change the rules, you go to one function, change it there, and all the programs will get that update. Categories of business rules. You can impose constraints on elements of the field specification for a particular field. An example is order dates are to be displayed in long form such as January 10, 20, or 2003. You would be amazed at the consternation that comes when you talk to people in Europe. They want to have day, month, year displayed, and people in America want month, day, year. That's something that you need to be sure that you're displaying the way that your users are used to it. Otherwise, you'll have errors because people will misunderstand 10. Somebody will say something happens on 4/8, and is that, if they're used to thinking 4 is a month and in fact it's a day, you'll cause problems downstream. We must be able to store the zip code for our Canadian customers is another type of a constraint that's imposed. So when we design the database, we need to not just have numbers like we have for zip codes, but we need to have the spaces needed for the Canadian postal codes. Defining and establish field-specific business rules. You define and establish each rule with these steps. And I would associate these steps much like if you play bridge, there's a way to count the points in your hand so you can decide what to bid. People who played a long time no longer count, well, I've got 3 queens and 2 kings and so forth. But it was a way to help them have a method to get to the place where they could do it without thinking about it intent. So the steps are: select a table, review each field and determine whether it requires any constraints, define the necessary business rules for that field, establish the rules by modifying the appropriate field specification elements, determine what actions test the rule, record the rule on a business specification sheet. And I would tell you that there's another way to come at this, which is while you were talking to the customers and the users and thinking about this, you should have written the business rules you could think of just on a sheet of paper. And after you've gone through this practice, one of the things I would have you do is look and make sure that all the rules that you identified talking to users, you've got someplace in your business rules that you've documented that are going to address that. There is a spreadsheet that you can download from Blackboard, and that's what I would recommend and what has been found to be a good way to get started on business rules. And so there's different tabs. There's database-oriented fields, there's database-oriented relationships, and there's application-oriented rules. And first we're going to work on the database-oriented, and so we're going to talk about a table name and a field name. Does that field need to be a key? And if it is it a compound key? Does it need to be unique? It may be that you want everybody to have a unique customer ID, but you allow 2 Bob Smiths to come in. You're not going to have the last name be unique. Is it okay to put in a null? I have people who say, well, I'm going to make them key everything. Well, you will find out that the users will revolt very quickly. And you get into the situation like you have a first name, a middle name, and a last name. Well, a lot of folks don't have a middle name, and so you want to accept nulls. Is there a required value? We talked about their start date can't be before their birth date, or if this was the VIN code or VIN location, VIN state, you're only going to allow Oregon, Washington, and the things we talked about. Is there a default value for this field? If you're having people enter their addresses and they're all in, or most of them are in Kentucky, it's helpful to not have them have to type KY every time. Is there a valid range? You want to have people enter the month they were born. You don't want to accept months below 1, and you don't want to accept months greater than 12. Values input by who put this information in, and is there a role statement, a rule statement that you need to put in some text to define that? So, we conduct business exclusively for the vendors in the Pacific Northwest. Well, that was the vendor table and the VIN state, and it's not a key type and it's not a key structure. It does not need to be unique. We will not accept a null. Required values are Washington, Montana, and whatever else we said. If we're working out of the state of Washington, we may decide to give it a default value just to save time. It's not a valid range because we have a finite set that we can have. It's not really a number. The values we're going to input by the person creating the vendor record. And the rule statement would be, we conduct business exclusively in the Pacific Northwest. And then you repeat that for every field, every table, and every field in every table in your database. The next tab we have is the database-oriented relationships. And an example could be a ship date cannot be prior to an order date. So if the parent table is order and the primary key fields for that one are order number, and the child table is shipments, and the parent minimum cardinality is you can't have less than one. Every parent has to have at least one shipment. Or are you going to let create an order before you have shipment. So the minimum may be 0, but this is how many parent entries can you have? I'm sorry. How many children can you have for each parent? And then you may make a rule that you're never going to let anybody ship more than 10 shipments for an order. But that's a business decision you make. And then a rule statement, just text what is it that you're trying to do with this rule. The last tab is Application Orient Rules. And that is something along the lines of a customer with a preferred status receives a 15% discount. So that's what we're going to have in the rule statement. We're going to, I guess, do it on the invoice table and what discount field. We've got a rule statement. And so then how are we going to, what are the steps that we're going to do to enforce that in code? People have had questions about business rules. I hope that this has clarified them. But know that if there's something that you don't understand or if you have a question, please check my office hours. Send me an email of what time during those office hours you'd like to set up an MS Team meeting. I want to explain this. I know a million different ways to explain it. I've tried not to bore people, but I may have gone too fast or said it in a way that you don't understand. But be assured, I want to say it in a way that you will understand, because like anything technical, until you understand it, it's complex and obtuse. And when you understand it, it becomes simple. My goal is to get you to simple. Thank you for your time.